Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is the impacts of policies and business models on income equity and rooftop solar adoption. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we have with us a couple of excellent guest speakers, as well as our host for today's webinar, Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance. And before I pass it over to him, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of the attendees for today's webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect via telephone or using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there on your screen, and you can also click on that to expand the webinar console. And one of the reasons you might like to expand your webinar console is to view the questions box. We encourage you to submit your questions and your comments throughout the webinar. We're going to save about 15 minutes for Q&A with our panelists at the end of their presentation. And we do have a lot of people registered today, so we do expect a lot of questions. To make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. And a final note, we are recording this webinar. We'll send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording within about 24, 48 hours, probably this afternoon. And we'll also be posting those materials on our website at cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Nate Hausman. As I said, Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance. Nate, over to you.
Great, thanks, Sam, and welcome everyone. Sure enough, I'm Nate Hausman. I'm a project director at CISA, and I focus on solar policy and help lead a CISA project on scaling up solar for under-resourced communities. So first, a quick note about CISA and who we are. We're a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations. We work together to advance clean energy, and we're mostly comprised of state-level agencies. You can see our members, their logos on this slide. Great. So as Samantha said, this webinar is about new research from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab on the impact of policies and business models on income equity in rooftop solar adoption. We've got two presenters who will share their research. They both have extensive credentials, but I'm going to keep my introductions of them brief since this audience may be familiar with them, having seen them on past webinars before. First, Galen Barbos will introduce the research. Galen is a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab, where he conducts research on renewable energy markets and policies with a focus on distributed solar. Among other activities, Galen leads Berkeley Lab's annual Tracking the Sun report series and its annual Renewable Portfolio Standards Status report. Since joining Berkeley Lab in 2001, Galen has authored more than 100 publications and has presented his work on hundreds of occasions in a wide range of forums. Then next, we'll hear in more detail about the research findings from Eric O'Shaughnessy. Eric is a renewable energy research consultant working on projects for Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and World Resources Institute. Eric specializes in analysis of distributed energy resource and voluntary green power markets. He received a PhD from the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Okay, again, just a reminder to type your questions as they come up. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Galen. The platform is yours.
Great, thanks, Nate. And thanks, Sam, for hosting us and everybody on the line for joining today. So I wanted to just give a very quick introduction before handing the baton over to Eric. Really mostly for the purpose of just kind of framing the work that you'll hear about today within the broader body of ongoing research at Berkeley Lab that really kind of centers on understanding trends in demographics among residential solar adopters and kind of understanding the potential strategies that might exist and efficacy of those strategies in advancing solar access among lower and moderate income households. That body of research, really the foundation of much of that work is data, and in particular household level PV data, which we then link with various sources of in many cases, household level income and demographic data. Indeed, that's the basis of the analysis that you'll be hearing about today. Using that data, we put out a series of annual tracking reports that really are intended to just kind of describe some of these basic demographic and income related trends. We put out the inaugural version of that report at the beginning of this year, and we'll be putting out an updated version in the next month or so. We also have a data visualization tool, in fact, that Eric O'Shaughnessy developed, that accompanies those reports and allows folks to kind of explore and dig into that data in ways that we're not able to within the actual report itself. We've also offered technical assistance to organizations that are working in this space, particularly when there are opportunities to leverage the data that we've collected to help understand trends within particular regions or within particular market segments. And then the kind of last thread of this body of research is sort of more in-depth topical studies that really aim to dig into particular issues or topics. And in fact, what you're about to hear about today is really an example of that, and is the first kind of study in that thread that we've completed. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Eric, who will lead you through this research. Eric.
Great, thanks, Galen. So yeah, I'm going to present mostly on a paper that we just published in Nature Energy. As often with these, I'm going to cover a lot of ground in not much time, and there's a lot more behind the presentation here, so I encourage folks to follow up with the study itself, and the slides will obviously be available as well. There we go. So a really quick summary of what I'll go through in the high-level findings here. The key points for context, as many people on the webinar probably are aware of, is that low and moderate income LMI households are significantly less likely to adopt rooftop solar, than high income households. We refer to this as PV adoption inequity, where equity would essentially be that solar adopter incomes are similar to the broader income distributions of the general population. Adoption inequity poses energy justice questions, and it could decelerate PV deployment. The motivation for this paper was to look into 5 policy and business model interventions to see if they could somehow adjust adoption equity. And 2 high-level findings, and as always, if you come away with nothing else, bear these 2 key findings in mind. The first one is that 3 of these 5 interventions are associated with more adoption equity, so higher rates of adoption by LMI households. And we'll get into the details of which interventions had this effect. But the key point here is that if you ask the question, does solar adoption have to be inequitably distributed with respect to income? The answer is no. The evidence here is that there are measures available that could adjust and increase adoption equity. The second key finding is that this occurs in 2 ways. The first is by deepening markets, that is increasing the pool of adopters in existing markets. These are typically relatively affluent areas, but obviously there are LMI households in these areas, and expanding adoption to those households. And the second effect is what we are calling broadening the market, that is shifting solar into communities that did not previously have access to solar. So shifting solar into previously underserved low-income communities. This is just a brief slide, and something that Galen was mentioning. This is part of a broader body of work. Lots of extra resources available at the link here. There's this solar demographics tool. There are data available at the tool. I encourage everyone to go check that out and the other work going on at the lab. And part of the key context from that work is what sets up this study. And there are kind of 2 high-level points. One that I just mentioned, so high income households have been historically more likely to adopt solar than LMI households. And the other key trend picked up in this work at the lab is that that's adjusting over time. So low income households are increasingly adopting solar. As a result, solar adoption equity is increasing, but not remarkably. And that's really summarized in this figure here. So the blue line shows the percentage of adopters earning less than their county median income. So if solar was equitably distributed, you'd expect 50% of adopters to earn less than the county median income. That'd be the 50% distribution, represented by that orange line at the top. And you can see that we were very far from that point in 2010. Roughly 17% of adopters earn less than county median income. So about 33 points off from equitable. It's increased, but not really by a remarkable amount. So we're now up to about 22%, so just 28 points below equitable. Another way of thinking about this is in terms of the geographic distribution of solar. Solar tends to cluster in certain areas, which is a theme that we'll come back to later on. And specifically, it tends to cluster in high income areas. So we use the data on our site to pull out this kind of easy to remember stat. High income households are about 4 times more likely to adopt solar than low income households. And that adoption inequity is really largely a reflection of these geographic patterns. So in this figure, it's split by zip codes, where the zip code median is below or above the median income of all zip codes. Again, if solar were equitably distributed, you'd expect both bars to be at 50%. But we see that zip codes below weighted median income are underrepresented. So solar adoption tends to be significantly lower in those zip codes. And obviously that implies that solar adoption is overrepresented in relatively affluent zip codes. Just another way to visualize solar adoption inequity. And that sets up the study. So why is this a problem? There are a few different ways to think about it. The first is this broad topic of energy justice. This being the idea that the benefits and costs of energy systems should be equitably distributed across society. Quite intuitively, PV adoption inequity violates those principles and could perpetuate energy justice issues. The second is this concept of energy burden, being that LMI households dedicate larger shares of household incomes to energy expenses. Rooftop solar could be part of the solution to energy burden. Obviously, rooftop solar adoption can reduce home electricity bills, but PV adoption inequity really limits those potential benefits. There's also the potential under existing rate structures for cross-subsidization, meaning that LMI households actually see their electricity costs go up as a result of PV adoption by higher income households. And finally, beyond all these questions of energy justice, there's the simple fact that nearly half of all PV viable hosting space is on LMI buildings. So if we have a significant underrepresentation of LMI adopters in rooftop solar markets, you'd expect that to just decelerate deployment and all the clean energy benefits associated with rooftop solar deployment. So now let's move into some potential solutions to these issues. We can think about the types of barriers that LMI households face, and then begin to think about solutions to directly address those barriers. There's lots of them. We know cash constraints, lower rates of home ownership, language barriers, and many others discussed in the paper. And we thought certain policy and business model interventions might address these barriers. And a key point I should emphasize is that we explore policies and business models, but with one exception, none of them were designed to increase adoption equity. And that we knew that going in. We essentially said there may be existing interventions and policies that have this effect of affecting adoption equity, even if they're not necessarily designed to do so. And we look at 5 interventions. The first is incentives. These are upfront rebates or ongoing incentives that are available to all adopters. The second category is what we call LMI incentives. Rebates or ongoing incentives that are restricted to LMI households, meeting certain income criteria. The third is leasing, where adopters can make ongoing payments through a lease or power purchase agreement rather than buying the system outright. The fourth is PACE, property assessed clean energy financing, where customers can pay down solar on their residential property tax bills. And the fifth is Solarize, essentially a bulk buying campaign organized locally. And the goal is to answer two research questions and keep these in mind as we move forward. The first is which of these interventions are associated with higher PV adoption equity? And that question is framed purposely. It's because it's not necessarily which interventions are not necessarily cause or designed to affect adoption equity, but by the nature of the intervention, it may be associated with higher PV adoption equity, and we can use that fact. The second research question is, where do these effects come from? Does it come from deepening markets, increasing LMI adoption in existing markets, or does it come from broadening the markets by driving PV into previously underserved low-income communities? The data, most of the data come from tracking the sun, which was discussed earlier. A lot of the data are publicly available. The link here, I encourage folks to go and play with it themselves. We do combine the TTS data with modeled household level income estimates. The household level data are not available, although some aggregated income estimate data are available from the Solar Demographics tool, which is available at the link on the second slide or third slide. The final data set in the study is a bit over 1 million records representing systems installed 2010 to 2018 in 18 states. And we augment the data using demographics data from the US Census. Some key metrics that I'll be using these terms for the remainder of the presentation. The first is LMI household. We came up with these just for the purposes of this study. An LMI household, for our purposes, a household earning less than their county's median income. A low income community is a zip code in the bottom quartile, according to median household incomes of other zip codes in the state. Adopter income bias is a key metric in our study. And this is the difference between adopters' income and their county's median income. So for example, if a household earns $70,000 and lives in a county where the median income is $60,000, the adopter income bias in that case would be $10,000. And we know, just looking at historic data, adopter income bias will tend to be positive. Most adopters earn more than their county's median income. And the fourth is LMI PV adoption rate. That is the number of LMI households per 1,000 owner-occupied LMI households in a zip code that have adopted. I'm not going to get into the details of the methods here. Obviously, there's plenty more details in the paper for those who are into methods. But at a very high level, I'm going to present the results of two different types of analysis. The first, this analysis of income bias. So assessing relationships between the interventions and differences in adopter income bias. Again, that being the difference between adopter income and county median income. We can look at if certain interventions are associated with higher or lower bias. And if interventions increase adoption equity, we'd expect to find them associated with less income bias. And as a reminder, it's a negative income bias, meaning that the adopter earns less than their county median income. The second type of analysis is effects on LMI PV adoption rates. This is more of a typical before and after. And in the paper, we get into the details of it. We use a difference in differences method to more effectively tease out the causal dynamics of these interventions on LMI adoption rates. So for some results, This is the only table in the presentation. So the 3 of the 5 interventions I mentioned up front are associated with less income bias. So again, less income bias, meaning they're associated with households either earn closer to, or in some cases less than their county median income. And these interventions, we use this as evidence that these interventions are associated with higher adoption equity. The 3 interventions being LMI incentives, leasing, and PACE. And this table here is based on the results of a regression. The numbers can be interpreted as the differences in adopter income bias associated with the interventions. So we see LMI incentive, or adopters that use LMI incentives, earn about $47,000 per year less on average. Lessees, PV lessees, earn about $11,000 per year less, and PACE, customers that use PACE, earn about $9,000 per year less than other adopters, all else equal. There's lots of control variables in the regression, and these results are very robust to a large number of alternative model specifications. So these 3 effects seem to be particularly strong. There's this clear association between the 3 interventions and lower adopter incomes. We do not find that in the case of incentives and Solarize. With incentives, we sort of expected this to be the case. There's been previous work showing that incentives tend to flow to high income customers. So we weren't really expecting a negative or a association with more adoption equity in that. And with Solarize, it's just sort of a non-effect. You see there, it's not statistically significant. It's missing its little star. And with Solarize, I typically say we don't find evidence that Solarize increases adoption equity, but that's not to say that it could not. Clearly, Solarize campaigns could be designed with adoption equity in mind. It's simply the data in this case do not support that based on existing Solarize campaigns. So with that said, we're going to focus on these 3 interventions moving forward. Another way of visualizing these associations is to look at the rates at which different adopters and different income bins use the interventions. So in this figure, the bins are in terms of percentage of county median income. So the far left is the lowest income bin. These are adopters that earn less than 25% of their county median income. And then moving to the right, the far right bin are adopters that earn more than county median income. And we can see in each case that the lower income adopters use these interventions at higher rates than higher income adopters. This is particularly stark in the case of LMI incentives, a little less so in the case of leasing, and then even less so in the case of PACE, which is consistent with a theme I'll hit on throughout, that the effect of LMI incentives is the largest, followed by that of leasing, followed by that of PACE, which is intuitive, given that LMI incentives are, by their definition, distributed to LMI households. But again, the key point here, the data clearly support that low-income LMI households rely on and benefit from these interventions more so than high-income households. Another way of visualizing it, so these plots are a bit complex, but they're very useful, so let's walk through them. Like I said, the one issue in methodologically with testing these effects are that different interventions are staged at different times. So it's not like a clean before and after that in some state, they implemented it and every single zip code, county area received incentives all at the same time. Unfortunately, these programs were not rolled out in that way. So we get around that by looking or leveraging the fact that certain clusters or groups of zip codes received, quote unquote, the interventions at the same time. So again, the study runs from 2010 to 2018. So we have 36 quarters. And in this figure, moving left to right represents those quarters, 2010 to 2018. And the y-axis refers to different groups of zip codes that received the interventions in the same quarter. This diagonal point, therefore, represents the first quarter in which each zip code began receiving incentives. So points to the left are before the incentives are rolled out or the interventions are rolled out, and points to the right of the diagonal are quarters after the interventions began. So in the case of LMI incentives and leasing, we see this pretty clear darker, and the fill color here is the LMI adoption rate, the number of LMI households adopting per 1,000 owner-occupied LMI households. In the case of LMI incentives and leasing, we see a relatively convincing before-after trend. So LMI adoption rates appear to increase after the interventions were implemented. We really don't see that in the case of PACE. Again, PACE is a relatively lower effect size, so it's not particularly surprising. In the case of leasing, one thing to bear in mind here, because leasing is a particularly obvious example. There is this clear increase in LMI adoption after leasing was implemented. With leasing, the story is one of a rising tide lifts all boats, that wherever leasing was rolled out, PV adoption tended to increase in general. And the data here are really the first time to show that that also translated to increasing LMI adoption. So wherever leasing installers began marketing, began offering their leasing model, that also is associated with increased LMI adoption rates. Another way of viewing these effects using a more robust statistical model is looking at these are coefficients on a difference in difference model. So obviously that before and after that is showed, that could reflect different time trends. There could be some spurious correlations. So to really tease out this effect, we concentrate on using a difference in difference model to isolate the more causal effects of the interventions on changes in adoption rates. The y-axis in this refers to the effect. So a positive above 0 is represents an intervention that's associated with higher LMI adoption rates. And the x-axis here is referring to the number of quarters from when an intervention began. So the key point on the x-axis is 0, that being the first quarter where the interventions began. And again, in the case of LMI incentives and leasing, we see these clear spikes in quarter 0. So wherever interventions began, LMI adoption rates tend to increase abruptly. And the important point here is that these are increases above historical rates. So it's not just a coincidence LMI adoption rates went up. The data provide pretty clear, strong evidence that the interventions are associated with real increases in LMI adoption rates. We see some of that in the case of PACE, not statistically significant. Again, the effect on PACE is simply smaller. And then in the case of both LMI incentives and leasing, we also see these lagged effects. So even beyond quarter 0, there's clearly an increase in LMI adoption rate. And that could be a couple things. So one, incentives kept rolling out, or PV and leasing installers kept offering services in those zip codes. So you'd expect there to be a sustained increase in LMI adoption. And the second possibility is something I'll get into again later, is spillover. So as PV gets into new markets, it tends to spill over to other households in the case of LMI incentives or leasing. So an easy example of this is one household adopts in a zip code, and then they offer, installers quite frequently will offer referral bonuses. So this can cause PV to bounce around within an area. So it creates this lag sustained increase in adoption among LMI households. And then the second research question was about deployment shifting. Do the interventions not only deepen the market, but do they broaden it? Do they move solar into relatively underserved low-income communities? And the data also provide evidence of deployment shifting. They support that hypothesis as well. Probably the easiest way to think about that is just to think about adoption rates in low-income communities using the different incentives. So some really easy numbers, in each case higher. So in the case of LMI incentives, about 5% of adopters in low-income communities, again, these are zip codes in the bottom quartile of income, about 5% of adopters in low-income communities received LMI incentives compared to about 1% in all other areas. So when you think about this, adopters in LMI communities, low-income communities, are about 5 times more likely to benefit from LMI incentives, which provides pretty clear evidence consistent with this hypothesis of deployment shifting. And then in the case of leasing, about 49% of adopters in low-income communities use leasing compared to about 42% in other areas. And then as always, PACE, the difference is not quite as large, but it's still there, about 3.4% compared to 3%. Another way to visualize this, so we can predict the number of systems that would be adopted by LMI households based on the adoption rates of systems that did not use the interventions. So the empty circles here are the predicted number of installs. High income zip codes, are zip codes in the top quartile of incomes, and low income zip codes, again, the bottom quartile. So for each intervention, we see that the actual number of LMI installs using these interventions was below the predicted. So our predictions consistently exceed the actual intervention, the actual installations using interventions. So what that means is that intervention-supported systems are relatively underrepresented in high-income areas. Conversely, we see that the predicted values consistently underestimate the number of LMI installs in low-income zips. So again, what this is really showing is deployment shifting. And perhaps it's easiest to see in the case of LMI incentives. You see in high-income zips a clear decline in installations, and in low-income zips a clear increase. So you're getting a lot more adoption in low-income communities using these interventions than you would have expected otherwise. And similar to the first model, we use a before-after difference in differences model to more robustly establish this effect. And consistent with other results, it's particularly strong for LMI incentives, which again is intuitive. LMI incentives are designed for LMI households, and in some cases, programs are designed to target LMI communities. So that makes sense why we see such a strong shift in the case of LMI incentives. The effects are a bit weaker, or significantly weaker in the case of leasing, and then a bit weaker in the case of PACE. So why does this matter? I've been emphasizing, talking about deployment shifting. Well, why is this so important, and why were we interested in it? So this graphic is a simple way to explain all of that. Beginning on the left, this is kind of what we've historically seen, that solar tends to cluster in high-income neighborhoods. And that's for a variety of reasons that won't get into here. But that's essentially the historic pattern, clustering in high-income neighborhoods. The idea in the middle panel is perhaps because of an LMI incentive or maybe leasing, one home in an LMI community adopts solar. We can think of this as a seed adoption in an LMI neighborhood. And this matters because there's plenty of sociological research showing that solar tends to spread. The reason that it clusters is that households around a solar adopter become more likely to adopt themselves if they see solar on a neighbor's rooftop, if they speak to a neighbor that has adopted. These types of interactions are known as peer effects, when a certain person is more likely to adopt as a result of seeing that a peer has done so. So the hypothesis here is if you can get a single system, a seed adopter, into a low-income neighborhood, then perhaps you could catalyze these peer effects, and that would result in these spillovers. So maybe it just takes one or two or a few intervention-supported systems, and then even if the intervention goes away, like if an LMI incentive program expires, you may still generate these self-sustaining cycles of adoption through these spillovers. And that's the situation depicted in the far right here. And beyond the peer effects, another potential force would be attracting more installers into low-income neighborhoods. Solar, there's a lot of survey research showing that solar adoption is often quite a passive activity. Many households didn't really think about adopting until one day an installer knocked on their door, and that got them thinking about it, and they adopt in response to that external cue. And oftentimes in a low-income neighborhood, there aren't those external cues. Installers may not market in low-income neighborhoods. They might not do advertising in low-income neighborhoods. There's no exposure to the idea that solar adoption is possible. But again, perhaps by bringing a seed or a few seed adopters into a low-income neighborhood, that could convince some installers that maybe there's some business opportunities in those neighborhoods. Bring installers into the neighborhood, begin marketing, advertising, again, generate a self-sustaining cycle of adoption, even when the interventions themselves go away. So to go over those two key points again, the first, that 3 of the 5 interventions that we looked at were associated with more equitable PV adoption. Again, those were LMI targeted incentives, leasing, and property assessed financing. And a question that maybe will come up to thwart it, because it often is a follow-up to this, is why those 3? Why are those three associated with adoption equity, not the other 2? And one way to think about it that we suggest in the paper is that these 3 interventions directly address the barriers faced by LMI households. They also, in all 3 cases, entail some way that LMI households can distinguish themselves. So with LMI targeted incentives, there's an income criteria, so that one's straightforward. With leasing, the economic benefits of leasing are lower throughout the lifetime of the system than ownership. So there's a certain sacrifice to be made there. So if an LMI household chooses to lease, that is still a choice. So they're still signaling the fact that they benefit from leasing because they may face cash constraints that keep them from buying their system outright. And then with PACE, property assessed financing, there's still paperwork, there's still a process to go through to get PACE. That's not the case for incentives and rebates where everyone is available. And then Solarize, which is essentially a campaign, and then once it starts, anyone can sign up regardless of their income, and there's no particular benefit based on income level. So these 3 interventions really more directly address the specific barriers faced by LMI households. And then the second key point, that we find evidence that these interventions both increase equity in existing markets, deepening market, and they also push PV deployment into previously underserved low-income communities, broadening the market. And again, the second effect really matters, because if we can broaden markets, if these interventions, other interventions can have this effect of broadening markets, it may catalyze processes like peer effects, installer marketing, and generate self-sustaining increases in PV adoption, even for systems not directly supported by interventions. And just to conclude with some ideas and areas of further research that we and others are pursuing. So one piece we did not touch on at all in this paper is, it's one thing to say that these interventions can increase adoption equity, but even if adoption equity increases, what does that translate to in terms of energy justice benefits. So we can assume that solar adoption reduces energy burden, but it would be nice to actually quantify those effects. It'd be nice to quantify how effective different options are at doing that. So I mentioned that leasing is a great option because it reduces or eliminates upfront costs, but in the long term, the economic benefits of leasing are actually less than PV ownership. So there are trade-offs here in terms of the different pathways to address these energy justice issues. The second is to further explore these spillover impacts. It's a nice hypothesis. There's solid evidence. Peer effects is very well founded. The effects of installer marketing, likewise, supported by really strong literature. But it would be nice to quantify the degree of these potential spillover impacts, because if we knew how strong they were, that could provide evidence that these types of interventions or LMI incentive programs are actually undervalued. Because if we only measure and evaluate LMI incentives or other programs based on their direct impacts, we are ignoring the fact that they may generate additional adoptions through these spillovers. So it's an important question to understand the magnitude of those spillover impacts. And then finally, we only look at 5 interventions in this paper, and there are 5 interventions focused specifically on rooftop solar. There are many other possibilities out there in the solar space and broader energy justice space, many other potential policy pathways. One in particular is community solar. We don't look at community solar because it's not rooftop PV, but community solar addresses many of the barriers associated with LMI adoption. And I know that CISA is involved with community solar work. It's another pathway definitely meriting further research. So with that, here are the contact info for all of the authors. I'd like to thank CISA for hosting this, and encourage everyone listening to go follow up with all the links here, go find the paper, read through all the details that I had to gloss over for purposes of the presentation. And with that, I will open up to questions.
Great, thanks so much, Eric. Your presentation has generated a lot of interest and a lot of questions in the questions box, so thanks for folks for typing those in. First question says 42% of PV potential is on LMI buildings, but you seem to indicate that you expect penetration parity above and below median income. Can you explain?
Yeah, so the 42% comes from some combination of sizes of rooftops, so the actual space in terms of square meters, which considers things like the fact that many LMI households live in multifamily buildings versus high-income households tend to live in single separate buildings. So there's some reason to expect that skew. I don't recall exactly how that study, so that statistic comes from an NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab study. I don't remember exactly how they define LMI household, but that would be my hunch for why that's a bit below 50%. And then with the adoption equity, the reason to expect that on my initial slides to actually see that equity point is because that would be based on income levels. So if clearly, one of the reasons that it's never going to get quite to equity is because LMI households tend to rent more frequently than high-income households. But that's just another way of expressing that that's a barrier faced by LMI households to solar adoption. So it's a good point that there's some amount of inequity sort of fixed into the different housing patterns, but certainly that discrepancy, say between the 42% and the 22% that I presented on the third slide, is still about 20 percentage points.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions about assumptions around PV lowering total bills. So slide seems to mean that all else being equal, customers with PV are likely to have lower bills. Is that a correct reading of the slide? If so, why is that? Lower energy purchases, et cetera. And another asked, does your research assume that solar adoption by low-income customers is always a net positive economically for the low-income customer? There are examples of solar contracts being an economic drag for low-income customers. Have you thought of a metric that measures both PV installations and net benefit to the LMI customers that adopt solar?
Right, so I kind of mentioned this in the last slide that we don't make any assumptions or attempt to analyze any way effects on customer bills in this paper. That's an area for further research. The one piece of that question I can certainly answer is that all else equal, with solar adoption, the easiest one to think about is ownership. If a customer owns their panels, they are going to save money on the electricity bill based on the delta between whatever the levelized cost of electricity is for what they paid for solar and the amount they would pay on their rate. In something like an LMI incentive, that value is definitively positive because it's subsidized. With leasing, it's correct that there's no guarantee of savings there. However, in the current environment, supported by local incentives as well as federal tax credits, it is generally the case that that is going to result in long-term savings. But those are great questions and areas for further research to really quantify the effects of solar adoption on energy burdens.
Great. We've got a handful of questions on a bullet point you had on cross-subsidization in one of your earlier slides, and I'll sort of lump as many of them together as possible. Sort of, can you explain that further? Some people said, isn't that a myth? Is there a value of solar that can address the subsidization issue without the kind of interventions you're talking about? What rate structures do not contribute to this problem?
Isn't that a myth? So the cross-subsidization it has sort of gained a mythological status. Theoretically, there's a strong theoretical reason to expect that would occur in the long run. And we don't have time to get into why that is here. Whether it is in fact happening is a different question. So that's why in the paper, and I believe in the slide, we talk about the risk of cross-subsidization. There is a risk that that happens. That's different than saying it is actually happening or it will happen. So that's one thing. And it is also, I would agree, that can be addressed through rate reform. Efforts like value solar tariffs, one of the key reasons that utilities in states like New York and California are taking up value solar or DER type rate reform is to directly prevent the risk of cross-subsidization. So it's correct that that's one reason to think about ways to increase adoption equity, but there are other ways to directly address that problem.
Great. A question about PACE. What is it that specifically drives better adoption for LMI customers? Is there something about the features of that type of financing? It's clear from the benefits of leasing. It's clear what leasing benefits are, but that that overcomes the ITC monetization. But what is it about the PACE mechanism?
Well, I would say PACE is comparable to leasing, and with leasing, it's not necessarily because of the tax benefits. Obviously, being able to monetize the ITC is important, but with both leasing and PACE, I think the key mechanism is the ability to adopt solar with little or no upfront cost. That by and large is the key benefit to cash-constrained LMI households. So with PACE, you can adopt solar and then financing it over a longer term through property tax payments, rather than taking out, say, a loan or making a large upfront payment.
Great, and maybe you got at some of this before, but a question about leasing. Leasing can certainly reduce those upfront costs, as you just mentioned, but tends to increase the overall cost to homeowners compared to an upfront purchase. It also can make solar companies more money. So the leasing effect could just be a way of solar companies signing up more LMI households, but providing less savings for those LMI households.
Could be. I'm not sure exactly what the question is there, but we do mention that in the paper. Yes, leasing tends to be less financially beneficial to households. It's a different question. It's one thing to say you earn less leasing than owning. It's different to say that you earn less leasing than not adopting. So leasing should, all else equal, generally still benefit LMI households. So the key question is the LMI household better off leasing than not adopting solar at all? And that's really the question about energy burden reduction, risk, and areas for further research.
Gotcha. So, and perhaps you've answered this too, but do you see relatively more LMI households choosing a lease options relative to high income households?
Yes. So that's essentially what the adopter income bias results tell us, is that low income households lease more frequently than high income households. Yes.
Great. And then there's a lot of questions related to a bullet point that you mentioned towards the end about some of the assumptions related to single family homes and how, for example, community choice aggregation is accounted for, how some of those other models and the lack of accounting for multifamily and condominium units and the like. Do you have anything more you want to say on that point?
So just to clarify, that's here, the third bullet here, you think?
Yes,
Community
correct.
solar as an example? Yeah. I guess I probably could say a lot. We don't really explore it in this paper. I single out community solar here because that addresses a lot of these issues. If for LMI households that rent or for one reason or another just cannot host rooftop solar, community solar is a viable option. But yeah, I don't think for the purpose of this research we have much more to say in that space. Unless, I mean, Galen, I don't know if you could ace off. I don't know if we've talked about looking into multifamily, but it's a pretty small segment at this moment, so I don't know that we have too much more to say.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really looked at it, but it certainly is a relevant segment to explore further.
Sure. And is one reading of your research, it would be a fair reading to say that program designers might want to be thinking about how to weave together sort of combined and coordinated programming of some of the interventions you're talking about, so that the benefits of each will be greater than the sum of their parts?
Yeah, that's a fair reading. We don't really get much into that, the interactions between different interventions, but one example would be LMI incentives. There are programs like Connecticut's where they do effectively combine both. They provide subsidized leases is effectively there. So that's an example of those two coming together, and that does seem like a particularly effective program. So yeah, I think that's, I don't know that it's not really something you can directly get from the paper itself, but I think it's a good takeaway.
Great, thanks, Eric. Somebody comments, you analyze PACE, but not explicitly utility on-bill financing. Do you think there might be similar improvements for on-bill financing as PACE?
Yes, I would imagine so. Our selection of the different interventions was a lot, as often the case, was data driven, that we had access to data on which households use PACE. I would say more broadly, anything that allows a customer to finance, to reduce the upfront payment and pay down solar over time should generally have the effect of supporting more LMI adoption.
Great. And we did have a few questions. I don't know if you'll want to comment, but sort of on the reach of residential PACE and how available that is in the marketplace as an intervention currently.
At the moment, I believe it's only available in 3 states. And I believe in even those states it has come and gone, that our results are based almost entirely on the California PACE program. So it is not widely available, nor are LMI incentives.
Great. And here's a comment. It would be interesting to add a cost effectiveness component, the cost of the different interventions and different impacts per public dollars spent. Have you thought about follow-on research related to that?
Yeah, that is part of, we are involved in some follow-on research that considers that cost effectiveness angle. Yeah, yeah, I should probably stop there. Yeah, yes, we're considering it as an area for further research.
I might just add too that I mean, not all of the interventions necessarily are sort of programs or involve sort of a specific, public level, level of public funding support. I mean, third-party ownership is really a business model, and to the extent that there's a sort of a policy component to it, it's just really allowing third-party ownership, whether or not that is permitted in a given state. So in terms of thinking about this from a cost-benefit perspective, one would have to sort of take some of those distinctions in mind as well.
Great, and we're getting close to the top of the hour. There are a ton more questions and really good questions here, and so thanks everybody for typing those in. Appreciate it. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll just ask one more question that gets at, Eric, you mentioned financing generally, getting at some of this. The question is, low interest loans versus leases or third-party secured loans rather than leasing PV systems. Do you think this could have a stronger impact than leasing? Have you looked at the at LMI loans?
No, we have not looked at that yet. I don't have a strong prior on whether it'd be more effective, but just sort of bringing together some things we've been talking about throughout the Q&A, low interest loans would have this benefit of bringing together the combination of reducing upfront costs as well as potentially increasing the long-term benefits of adoption. So that's clearly, loans are an emerging trend in rooftop solar adoption in general. So yeah, there's every reason to believe that an LMI type loan could be particularly beneficial to increase adoption equity.
Great. Well, we'll call it there. But in addition to all the great questions that came in, you got a lot of compliments on the research and the value of this research. So you should take that to heart too. And again, I want to thank our audience for the good questions. And I also want to thank you, Galen and Eric, for your presentations. Those were great, and the research you've conducted here, really helpful in this space. Before closing out, I want to mention a couple of upcoming webinars that may be of interest to you that on related topics. So on Tuesday, December 8th, Green Link GreenLink's equity map, visualizing equity issues to build stronger climate solutions. We've got one on Thursday, December 10th on FERC Order 2222. On December 15th, using overbuild and curtailment to achieve 100% clean energy. And on December 17th, closing the energy and transportation affordability gap for Connecticut's LMI households. So thanks again for tuning in today, and I'll turn it over to you to close out, Sam.
Thanks, Nate, and thank you again, everyone, for attending. My last note is you can visit our website, cisa.org, for more info and resources, and that's also where you can find a recording of today's webinar. We will be sending that to you via email as well. So as Nate said, we've got a lot of webinars coming up, and we hope to see you at one of those. Thanks, everyone. Bye.